the Yorlynn Winfrey Talk Show. Continuing from last week's segment about world governments, we now move into comparing post-classical feudal systems. The two most predominant examples of feudalism in this era are located in Western Europe and Japan. The primordial developmental governments of feudalism are out in post-classical Japan and Western Europe in the approximate time period spanning around the 11th to 14th centuries. Let it also be stated that both of these areas, the concept of this method of rule did not fabricate itself out of thin air and grandiose ideas. There was reigning influence on China and Rome that impacted Japan and Western Europe, respectively. To give our audience the idea of Roman and Chinese institutions that impacted feudalism, we'll now go hear from Alex. Take it away, Alex.
Thank you, Yorlynn. Before we commence, it must be said that even with models of successful governments, a colony, so to speak, will not always mirror the success of its mother nation. This is proved as we evaluate the precedents of China and Rome on Japan and Western Europe. China attempted colonizing and sinificating Japan. However, the natives were too resilient to accept the rule of a foreign country. As the rule was refused, the customs, the traditions, and the political structures was more than loosely copied. Japan borrowed many aspects of its function from China, which acted as a model. The Japanese tried to enact a bureaucratic system, held Confucian values, and even used a simplified version of Chinese characters. There was a similar pattern in Western Europe and its attempts to recreate a Roman state. Western Europe attempted to hold a similar political structure based on that of Rome, but couldn't agree on standardized laws or organized armies. There was also no money to institute a bureaucracy.
That was Alex, our background information specialist. Now welcome to the studio, Ian and Mallory, our representative orators for Western Europe and Japan during the post-classical feudal age. We appreciate you coming and appearing on our show.
Happy to be here, Yorlynn. Why don't you do us the honors of introducing our topic to the audience?
Today's show will feature an analysis of the feudal system in Europe and Japan. The system that formed in these two distinctive locations found itself on different reasons that eventually led to different societal repercussions, even though the feudal systems were governed in a similar manner.
Yes, that would be correct. Now beginning on to our discussion.
The introduction of feudalism into Western Europe came about the time shortage and political instability to encourage economic growth and empirical expansion, while Japan developed a feudal system due to the gradual rise of the aristocratic class for the protection of the emperor.
The feudal system slowly began emerging in Western Europe during the 6th century as the Roman Empire collapsed and left the main law enforcers as the military. This led to the development of feudalism because the weak 9th century government under Charlemagne could not protect the peasants.
In Japan, feudalism began with the pursuit of landed estates, which gave the aristocracy more power. The elites that owned the estates grew into power by owning and managing the land, which usurped them over the court. Because of this, feudal system arose and gave power to those who owned the land.
But where they really differed in the way that the rulers formed. See, Charlemagne could not pay his bureaucracy, and he awarded them with land. The lords that ended up controlling the land distributed it to lower people who would either farm it or outsource it to others. This conceptual ideal was the basis of both methods of feudalism, but we'll discuss that later.
Very true. Feudalism developed in Japan to protect the emperor, not to serve as a method of their credit. The actual government could not produce an army, so the bushi, or warrior leaders of the state, provided military services to the emperor. The military that included the bushi also created the role of samurai, and they helped the emperor to keep peace within the capital. The samurai basically maintained a bodyguard position to officials.
That's nowhere near as important as the warring class of Western Europe. The kings used the feudal system to build their power and expand their territory. They also used marriages to further their empire, though a lot of the expansion occurred because of the loyalty of the vassals to the lords and the lords to the central monarch. The development of the state led to the king's ability to add urban businessmen or professionals to the bureaucracy, which could have led to economic expansion, along with the attempts of taxation that were enforced by the army.
Okay there, guys. let's go into the next topic, and don't sound so much like Stearns. So I've heard from Tom Cruise. The notions instigated upon the society of Western Europe were fairly oppressive. Conversely, society in Japan developed a highly honorable, structured culture among its people.
Japanese feudalism was slightly different from Western Europe's. Social honors were given to different classes. In Japan, during the reign of the third Tokugawa shogun, Iemitsu, farmers were not allowed to eat any of the rice they grew.
What?
They had to hand it all over to their daimyo and then wait for him to give some back as charity,
That's crazy.
thus proving the subjugation of peasants under the daimyo power. The farming class depended upon the military leaders to gain their sustenance. This was mirrored in Western Europe, except the honor was not expressed because the crops weren't demanded to be given to the government.
Yes, the peasants under the vassals were much like the serfs, and had to be self-sufficient off their crops, but are not allowed to surplus of them. The land they owned and could farm directly depended on the charity of the lords. However, they did not have to pay tribute.
Also, every third son in the family was required to serve in the military. Service was enforced upon the Japanese to serve in the army, and it forged a loyalty and honorable code of ethics within the samurais and those in service. Conversely, the peasant armies would raid and loot among their military path. Since the military duty was obligatory, most armies were poorly trained and made the common people miserable, which led to sporadic peasant revolts.
Western feudal society was contractual instead of a loyalty-based ladder of power. A vassal in the feudal society was one invested with a fief in return for service to an overlord. Guilds were built for artisans and merchants, which unified them during the political breakdown.
Well, the Japanese feudalistic society was complex and elaborate. The daimyos collected tax to support the village, and that built irrigation systems and communities. A commercial class arose because they were attracted to the cities, and Japan started trading with China. The growing commerce gave women opportunities, such as art, and they were independent from males. Yet women in the warrior classes could hunt, but they had less influence. The daimyos, however, went towards primogeniture and had women's rights stripped away.
What?
Women may not have had rights in Japan, misogyny, but more importantly, there was no citizenship or democracy, even though the feudal monarchy was representative. Bureaucrats separated their personal government accounts and specialized the people who served them. Through this, the kings gained power and attempted to force the church into paying taxes.
What?
The church limited feudal claims, which in turn limited aristocrats. Monks wanted to behave like feudal lords to gain power because the church had so much already and held the land.
The church actually used feudal systems to its benefit? That's so corrupt. But before we begin blasphemizing the church and its officials and provoke God's wrath, let's move on. The feudal system that developed in post-classical Japan and Western Europe heavily relied on military enforcement and the outsourcing of aristocratic lands to those of lesser stature. They developed similar forms of governing and methods of maintenance.
Feudalism essentially was a way to bring together a decentralized government by military aspect, as illustrated in the chart. In Japan, families of aristocratic elites had risen to landowners, estate managers, or state officials, establishing a house-governed society with little kingdoms. They took power away from the central government and gave it to those who reigned the small kingdoms. Feudalism allowed aristocrats to keep these as well as ration off areas of their lands to the daimyos.
I agree. Now look at my visual of the system in Western Europe. This government developed similarly. When leaders couldn't organize strong empires with armies and couldn't agree on standardized lawmaking, which broke them into regional societies that all pledged allegiance to the king, even though the real power remained that of those who owned the land that was given as payment and the knights who usually held the power on the estates.
If I didn't know better, I think you just stole my graphic.
No, actually I one-upped it.
Whatever. Japan was more blunt, taking it a step further by establishing the Bakufu government, which was the military government where the power resonated in the military and the samurai.
Even though Western Europe didn't establish Bakufu, They used military just as much to ward off invasions and protect their societies from other outside incursions. The king couldn't always protect all of his people, with his power over the aristocracy limited by the Magna Carta. This showed how vital the survival of Western Europe was to the aristocratic lords, reinforced their claims of power, but also checked the infantile monarchy by making sure no one group held too much power. The vassals sent representatives to create laws and enforce them. Some of the parliamentary decisions forged laws that provided protection to the overlords, the vassals, who provided military service, and then the serfs that worked on their land. Unfortunately, this created a largely regulated cycle for the serfs and the peasants, and they became semi-indentured to the land that they farmed. Service and crops were payment for the military protection.
I agree. Japan was also grounded on a set of political ideals and was governed by the military, with aristocratic lords effectively controlling the masses. Both of these parties had mutual obligations, such as protection in exchange for service and growing crops. It showed how necessary feudalism was, because when the centralized authority faltered and the Bushi warlords rose, the aristocracy shrank and full-scale civil war broke out.
On that note, audience, please thank Ian and Mallory for appearing on our show.
Well, thank you for having us.
You're welcome. That led into our conclusion of feudalism in Japan. Even though they recovered and their government became more centralized in Europe, the feudal system began to steer the government towards monarchy, which eventually developed the concept of parliament and representative government.
Well, the feudal systems in Western Europe and Japan developed in a similar style of government through military rule, and although this influenced their culture, they still varied greatly. This was seen in Japan through the integrity and loyalty of the Japanese military under the Bushi warlords that contrasted with the compulsory labor of the peasants under the vassals and the vassals under the lords, who were all under the power of the king. In Western Europe, the king initiated feudalism to expand his territory and try to create a stability in a time of political unrest, while the Japanese enacted the system to protect the emperor.
Well, thanks, Alex, for rudely interrupting.
Anytime!
But that's all the time we have. Since you so rudely summarized in my midst, we'll just have to pick up next time. So tune in for our next episode to see how bookbinding, post-classical China, and the harem in Islamic world subjugated women. And to our avid audience members, as you exit, feel free to pick up a crown as a gift. Signing out. This is Yorlynn Winfrey. Thanks for watching the Yorlynn Winfrey Show.